All right, well, looks like we are still having a few people trickle in, but 2 minutes after, so I think we'll go ahead and get started, everybody. Thank you everyone again for joining another week of UMN's Conservation Sciences Seminar Series. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mariella Superina. Before we get started, if you do have any questions throughout, feel free to drop them in the chat, or if you're brave enough, feel free to reserve them till the Q&A after, and we'll address them then. All right. So without further ado, Mariella is the chair of the IUCN Anteater, Sloth, and Armadillo Specialist Group. After graduating from the University of Zurich in Switzerland, she obtained a doctoral degree in veterinary medicine from the University of Zurich and a PhD in conservation biology at the University of New Orleans. She is now a research scientist with CONACET in Mendoza Province, where she studies the conservation biology and conservation medicine of armadillos, as well as the ecoepidemiology of Trypanosoma cruzi, the causative agent of Chagas disease. She is also an associate researcher of Fundación Omacha in Colombia, and the scientific advisor of the Conservation and Management Program for Armadillos of Llanos in Colombia. With that, Mariella, feel free to take it away. Thanks again for being here.
Hi, all. Thank you so much, Jake, and thanks everyone for inviting me to talk about armadillos, sloths, and anteaters, which you will see are just the coolest animals on Earth. Let's see if that works. So, we'll try to talk a little bit about the challenges of safeguarding xenotrans. It is quite a challenging task due to different reasons, as you will see. So actually, xenotrans, anteaters, sloths, and armadillos, have awoken the interest and curiosity of naturalists and researchers since their discovery, because they're unusual, they're different, they have a wealth of extraordinary characteristics. But still, there's a lot we don't know about them. They have very long fossil records. It's at least 60 million years old, but we suspect that the whole group is about or over 100 million years old. That's based on molecular data. So the fossil record of xenotrans is huge, especially of armadillos. And the interesting thing about that is that the comparison between glyptodons, let me see if I have a pointer here. That's one of the glyptodons here. And the comparison between glyptodons and extant armadillos was actually fundamental for the development of the evolutionary theory that Darwin developed. We actually suspect, or we're almost sure, that Darwin ate a lot of armadillos, and that's when he made that connection. He obviously also saw fossil sloths and extant sloths and made that link. So xenotrans have always been important, but still, we don't know much about them. So until about the 70s or 80s, they were classified in the order of Edentata, which means toothless. If you've ever seen a sloth, especially an aggressive sloth, you'll know they're not all of them toothless. Anteaters are, but not sloths and armadillos. And in that time, pangolins, this little creature, and aardvarks were also included in that same order. I think they just, lumped all the weird animals together. But with time, we saw that actually armadillos, sloths, and anteaters don't have much to do with pangolins and aardvarks, but they are a very cool example of convergent evolution. So if you look at the general shape of these three animals, they look quite similar, and that's probably one of the reasons why they were all classified as Edentata. They just have adapted over time to similar kinds of environment, although on different continents, and to similar diets, which were based mainly on the insects. And so that's why they have several traits that look the same. But still, as said, the pangolins and aardvarks have nothing to do with the other three taxa. So they made another order, which in the meanwhile is a superorder that is called Xenarthra. Some people say that Edentata is still a rather commonly used name just because it's easier to pronounce. That's unfortunately, it's a fact. So now we classify them as Xenarthra, which is a superorder, and within the Xenarthra we have two orders. One is the Pilosa, which includes anteaters and sloths, and the Cingulata, which includes all armadillos. So let's have a look at a little bit of taxonomy, not too much because we don't have time. But so until last year, we had 6 sloth species. But then we found out that the main sloth, this one in the middle, is actually a species complex. So it was split into 2 species, and now we have 7 sloth species. So that's where the problems start for us who work in conservation, because first of all, we need to know what we have so that we can assess their conservation status, assess their threats, and see where we need to intervene in terms of conservation. If you don't even know what you have, it's kind of difficult. Something very similar happened with anteaters. Probably you're familiar with the traditional or the older taxonomy that there were 4 anteater species, basically 1 giant anteater, 2 tamanduas, and 1 silky anteater. And Flavia Miranda, after 10 years of research, showed that there are actually 7 silky anteater species and not only 1. So now we have suddenly 10 anteater species, of which 7 are new, and we don't have ecological data. We don't know about their threats, so we don't even know exactly where they exist. So it is really difficult to assess their conservation status. And armadillo as well, that's something quite similar. Until 2015, the taxonomy was stable. We had 21 armadillo species. And then we provided evidence that 2 species were actually the same, so they were lumped together. So we went down to 20 armadillo species, and then another armadillo species, this one, the Dasypus capleri, was split into 3 species. So we moved up to 22 species, and others were split and others were lumped together. So if you ask me right now, I honestly don't know how many armadillo species we have, because we're still debating which taxonomic changes we're accepting and which we won't. But again, it's very difficult to do conservation if we don't even know what we have. So what is the main problem? There are not many researchers out there working with xenarthrans, although they are fascinating and unique. They're kind of difficult to study due to their habits. So armadillos live underground part of the time. Sloths and silky anteaters live in the forest canopy. So it's not easy to study them, but it's amazing. I mean, you have to be creative to study them. There's a lot of publishable stuff. But in terms of conservation, it worries us because we still have huge gaps in our knowledge. What we do know is their origin. So they're actually the real Americans. Their whole evolution that I mentioned is 60 or maybe over 100 million years ago took place in the Americas. They originated in South America, and still the large majority of species occurs only in South America. So if you look at that map, the dark spot here is where you can find all sloth species. So they're limited to tropical, subtropical regions. Anteaters have a little bit broader range. They go up to Central America and northern Argentina. And then we have armadillos that live from the southern tip of South America up to the US. So still, their range is rather limited. You won't find them in any other continent. So that also makes it very interesting to study them in evolutionary terms. So to move on to conservation, let me just tell you a couple of words about our specialist group. We are only 30 members, just because not many Xenarthra researchers exist, and even less who work in conservation. Our main goal is to safeguard all Xenarthrans and their habitats. And education is a fundamental part of our work because not much is known about them. Many people don't even know they exist. So I invite you to check out our website, because I cannot go into detail about the different species, but at xenartrans.org, you'll find species descriptions, range map. You'll find very cool animated videos about anteaters, another one about sloths, a third one about armadillos, and a fourth one about the evolution and the taxon as a whole. So there are also games for your kids, or even you if you're bored in your in your office. Just have a look at it, and if you have any ideas on how we could improve our education programs, we're also very happy to hear about that. And of course, our specialist group also does the assessments for the IUCN Red List of threatened species of all xenartrans. What I'm going to show you in the next couple of slides is based on our latest assessment that was done in 2015. So as said, the taxonomy has changed a lot since then. So we're in the process of reassessing all species, but it is a lengthy program because, yeah, we still have to define which species, which taxonomic changes we accept and which we don't. So we've concluded with the sloths, and we're working on anteaters, and then in the next step, we'll reassess all armadillo species. But basically, we have one critically endangered species, the pygmy sloth, that only lives in Panama on a tiny island. We have 4 vulnerable species, 5 near threatened species, and 5 armadillo species that are listed as data deficient. Due to all these taxonomic changes, it is highly probable that we will now have more data deficient species just because they're new and nobody has ever studied them in detail. So here in blue, you'll have anteaters and sloth, and in orange, all armadillos. And as you can see, we have quite a large proportion of species that are listed as least concern. It's not that they're not exposed to any threat, but actually we had to list them as least concern mainly because of their wide distribution. So we don't have population data of any xenartrans. So it's very difficult for us to assess whether the populations have declined in a certain percentage as required by the IUCN Red List. So if we had more information, probably we would be able to do a more thorough and more precise assessment of their conservation status. And also having 5 species as data deficient means that we don't even have enough information to know whether they are threatened or not, which is obviously a cause of concern because they could be at the brink of extinction and we just don't know about it. And also we've compared the global listing, which assesses species at the worldwide level, and the local listings of different range countries. And we've seen that more than half of the species that we list as least concern are actually threatened at the regional level. Some species that we list as least concern are threatened in different range countries. So we really need to fine tune a little bit our assessments and see what's going on if we have more objective data that would allow us to classify them, to list them in a threatened category. And then if we look at the threats, here you have all the pilosa, so anteaters and sloths in blue and armadillos in green. You can see that hunting and trapping is a huge problem for virtually all xenartrans, but the drivers of this threat are different for the 2 orders. For example, for armadillos, they've been hunted and used as a protein source for centuries. So they're very important especially for indigenous communities. And they have an historical and cultural importance due to that. The thing is that in recent years or decades, we've seen an increase in commercial hunting, although that's illegal in a lot of range countries. So usually if you have subsistence hunting, people have a better connection to the local wildlife, so they won't kill pregnant females, but only kill males, and will just kill as many animals that they need to survive. Whereas commercial hunting has an impact because hunters or poachers kill whatever they can find. So that's an increasing problem also for us in terms of armadillo conservation. Now, with the pilosa, the situation is quite different because they're not used as a protein source. But here we have another problem. Tamanduas, for example, are increasingly being used as pet species, although they really don't make good pets. The problem behind that is that to get hold of a tamandua offspring, you have to kill the mother. So poachers kill the females, get hold of the offspring, and then try to adapt them to an artificial diet, which usually doesn't work that well because they're insectivores. So we suspect that about 1 out of 10 tamandua offspring that are extracted from nature actually gets to the pet trade. So that's a huge impact because you have 10 females and you have these 9 other offspring that die so that one single individual can get into the pet trade, for example, in the US. So a lot of people who want to keep tamanduas as pets are not aware of that huge impact. And we have a similar problem with sloth that is unfortunately increasing. So if you look at websites, now you can do sloth yoga, you can do wine tasting with sloths, and all these sloths are extracted from the wild because breeding xenorchins under controlled conditions is extremely difficult. And with sloths, there is another problem that has increased significantly after the pandemic, which is the selfie tourism. So people want to experience something different, something amazing, so they travel abroad and they want to take pictures with wildlife for their social media. And sloths are slow, they are usually good-tempered, so poachers go to the field, kill the females, get hold of the offspring, and take them to the tourist. They offer them the tourist, they take pictures, pay for that, and these offspring do not adjust to a captive diet. They're just dumped into a basket or something at night, and when they die, these offspring are simply replaced by another one. So the impact in range countries is huge and is increasing. So that's another cause of concern for us. Land use change, I guess that this affects the majority of species on Earth. Some armadillo species can adapt to land use change. For example, hairy armadillos, this one here. They're very happy in agro-industrial fields, whereas, as you can imagine, a sloth could not survive if you have deforestation going on around its plot, because it will be limited to the forested area. And then you have also to consider indirect effects of land use change. So, for example, insecticide spraying kills the main food of armadillos and anteaters, and it can also affect them directly biopoisoning. So we have a lot of factors that can affect xenorchins, but to be honest, we don't know exactly how it affects them, just because of lack of field studies. Roads are another problem. Xenorchins have a lower metabolic rate, so they are a little bit slower than other mammals. And we suspect that road kills are an underestimated problem. So in some regions of Brazil, truck drivers think it's bad luck if a giant anteater crosses in front of their truck. So they have to kill it, and they really chase it down and kill it. And on the other hand, in Colombia, we've seen, I think, 1 dead tamandua per day on a certain road that we pass through to do field work. And the problem is also increasing due to road construction. So, for example, in Honduras, there are roads that are going to be built inside a protected area. So the impact, not only on xenorchins, of course, but on all wildlife, is significant. But we just don't have the data to quantify this impact. And then fire and fire suppression. In the 2015 assessment, we just consider that problem for about 30% of the pilosa, but it is certainly underestimated. So in the new assessments, we have actually listed that as a significant problem for the majority of the pilosa. Think about the wildfires that we've had in the Amazon over the past few years, or in Bolivia, in the Chiquitano forest, or in the Pantanal region in the wetlands of Brazil. They are significant. They're a huge problem, especially for sloths and anteaters that cannot escape. Wildfires can kill these animals directly, but also we've seen, for example, in Bolivia, sloths that died due to suffocation, due to the smoke. And of course, you also have the problem of habitat loss once these wildfires are extinguished, because reforestation, natural reforestation, is extremely slow and is not in the interest of the owners of these plots that were burned down. So we also have a habitat loss associated to these wildfires. So what do we do? What can we do against all these problems or to safeguard xenartrans? Here, I think it's important to consider that each country and each species probably needs its tailor-made conservation strategy. At some moment, we started developing an action plan for all sloths, but it's just not realistic, because to do conservation, you need to take into account local peculiarities. For example, traditions, cultural issues, even the economic development of the country. So what I'd like to do now in the second part of this talk is to show you 2 examples of conservation strategies. As I mainly work with armadillos, I'll focus on armadillos. I mean, we could do another webinar on conservation strategies for anteaters and sloth, which are also very, very cool. So we'll focus on Argentina, where I'm based right now, and on Colombia, where I lead a conservation program for armadillos. So we'll start first with armadillo conservation in Argentina, which is at the southern tip of South America. And I work in Mendoza. Mendoza is a province of 150,000 square kilometers in central west Argentina, close to Chile. So maybe you know the Aconcagua, which is the highest mountain in the Americas. That's part of Mendoza province. The climate here is arid to semi-arid. We have about 300 millimeters of rainfall per year. We have Patagonian steppe in the southern part of the province, so that's about this environment. And we have Monte region, which is shrublands with spiny trees, etc., in the eastern and the northern part of the province. Mendoza is special because all native wildlife is protected by law. So you're not allowed to hunt or to disturb or to keep native wildlife. And we have 5 armadillo species here, including this very cool animal, which is a pink fairy armadillo that I will not talk about today, although I'm fascinated by them. So I focused actually my PhD work on the pichi, which is this one. Pichi means small in an indigenous language. The pichi is a small armadillo that weighs about 1 kilo, 2 pounds. It lives only in Argentina and parts of Chile, although it is disappearing from Chile and we don't really know why. Pichis are adapted to living in a very dry environment, so they don't drink water, for example. They live on sandy soils, but actually that's all stuff that we didn't know when I started my work with pichis. So when I initiated my research about 20 years ago, we had very limited scientific information, and what we knew was actually based on anecdotal reports. We didn't have any population data, but locals would tell me that encounter rates were lower than 10, 20 years before. And also they reported local extinctions in some area due to a disease that they couldn't identify. And the other very important part here is that it still is the main target of poachers in Mendoza. They use them as a protein source, and they can get very aggressive about hunting armadillos. So apparently it's delicious meat. But it's also, it's a tradition. So they go out with lots of wine and spend a couple of days in the field with hunting dogs. And I think it's also the whole fun about being in the field and hunting that they think is cool. So first of all, I needed to know a little bit more about the species so that I could think about how to work on a conservation plan. So we started doing field research. We went to the field, drove around in our truck, we walked a lot, we went out on horseback just trying to find peaches. Each peachy we found, we would capture it and collect basically all the data we could. So we collected information on the natural history, which is fundamental. You need to know your species if you want to do conservation. I mean, I'm fascinated by genetic analysis, but if you don't know where the species lives and how the species lives, it's not useful. So we also wanted to know about physiology, about reproduction, about health issues. So we really collected all the data we could. The main problem was that sometimes we would go to the field, would drive 1,000 miles, and all we would see was this, a closed burrow. And this was inhabited because it's closed. And here you see that thin line, that's a track that the tail leaves. But we didn't know what was going on in these burrows. So we were missing a lot about their whole life history because we didn't know what they were doing underground. So after much debate, we built pens and we took armadillos home to study them under human care. Actually, the first animals that I used for my research were confiscated armadillos that needed to be taken care of, rehabbed. So I would keep them, take care of them, would breed them, and then I would release the adults and keep the offspring to do my reproductive and physiological studies. So what I did basically was to analyze fecal hormone levels to see when they were reproductively active and what their reproductive cycle was. So we found out that they are seasonal breeders. The offspring are born inside the burrow and they don't leave the burrow until they're weaned at about 40 days of age. So it was very surprising to see how fast they grow because of their low metabolic rate. But yeah, after 40 days of age, they're half the size of their mother and they're quite independent. So keep that information in mind because we'll need that later on for our conservation studies. And also we saw with the physiological studies and saw that peaches hibernate. That's really important to know because it helps us understand how they survive harsh winters in Patagonia where it snows, it can get very cold. And as I told you, the majority of xenarchans live in tropical and subtropical regions. So they have a physiological mechanism to cope with harsh winters. And it's also important for us to know as research, because if you do a census during winter, you won't find any peaches. And it could lead you to think that they're extinct in an area, but they're just hibernating inside the burrows. So that's a fundamental piece of work to understand the species itself. And we also did an experiment that showed that they enter torpor, which is kind of a short version of hibernation. It's less than 24 hours that they lower their metabolism and their body temperature to save energy. So when peaches are exposed to environmental stress, for example, extended droughts where there is no food available, there's no water, they enter deeper and longer torpor so that it can save more energy instead of wasting energy walking around and trying to find food. So this helps us understand how they cope with periods of prolonged drought, for example, and also helps us, think ahead with climate change. What is going to happen to the species? In some way, it is possible that they can cope with prolonged droughts, but we still need to understand if this impacts, for example, their reproductive rates. But it's a start. I mean, you have to start somewhere. And now in terms of conservation, it was fundamental to work with the authorities. I think that was a key part of the whole conservation work in Mendoza, and still is, because as mentioned, they're the main target of poachers. So they would be confiscated, but actually the rangers and the inspectors didn't care much about peaches. So I started accompanying them to the field, doing road controls with them, catching poachers, and would, just tell them what is so fascinating about xenartrans and about peaches in special. So this awoke their interest. They started observing armadillos in the field. They would report unusual behaviors, and would really start to collaborate and be interested. Now here, there's one piece of information that I really want you to take, not to forget, that usually we're used as researchers to write our reports and submit them to the authorities. The thing is that the rangers work in the field and they never get that information. And also, if we write our papers in English, but we work actually in a Spanish-speaking country, the ranger will not understand a word of our research results. So it is fundamental to provide your research results in the language that the local people speak, and to hand them over personally to the rangers, to give them a feedback so that they know what you found out and that it can help them in their collaboration and conservation strategies. So now I had the interest of the authorities, and suddenly they would find, for example, armadillos hit by a vehicle or injured by a poacher, and they didn't know what to do. So they would call me and ask me to do rehab work, which you would think, well, it's not related to conservation, but actually it is important because it allows you to learn a lot about the species. There's a huge benefit because you keep the authorities interested. And also, there are always media reports associated to rehab and rescue work and releasing the animals into the wild. That creates awareness. So it can be an important part of a conservation program too. And associated to that, I would also receive dead animals that the authorities would ask me to do forensic analysis on them. So remember what I told you about their reproduction. Now, this helped me a lot in forensic work, because if the poachers killed a pregnant or a lactating female, I would know and I would report that this meant that the offspring wouldn't survive. So the authorities then had an argument to impose a higher fine on the poacher. Instead of imposing a fine for one dead female, they would impose the fine for 3 dead animals, the female plus the 2 offspring that wouldn't survive. So that was important because it allowed them to increase the fines. We did the same also with the way that poachers killed and hunted and killed the armadillo. So for example, this one was hunted with a dog. So the dog injured the animals before it died, which is a huge stress and pain for the armadillo, which can be considered animal abuse. So this also allowed them to increase the fines. Education work is important, but it usually doesn't work with the poachers. So you have to hurt the poachers where it really bothers them, which is their bank account. So that was the way that we started reducing hunting pressure on the wild populations. But of course, we also did education and awareness work at schools, for example, because you also have to reach the children who can then teach their parents, or next generation will not poach as many armadillos. So that's what I did or I'm still doing actually, in Mendoza. But now let's move on and we'll go north to Colombia. Colombia is a very different part of the continent. There are lots of cultural differences, ecological differences to Argentina. I'm going to focus here on the eastern floodplains of Colombia, which is this part of the country bordering Venezuela. These are seasonally flooded floodplains. And here you can find also 5 species, but not the same as we have in Mendoza. So among others, you find the vulnerable giant armadillo here. And this one is a northern long-nosed armadillo that is now listed as near threatened. So when we started that project in 2012, actually there was virtually no information available about armadillos of Colombia. This has to do with the political situation in Colombia that during many, many decades had internal guerrilla problems, war actually. So it was extremely difficult, if not impossible, to do fieldwork on wildlife. So we did a literature analysis and saw that in 400 years, only 28 papers had been published on the armadillos of Colombia, and only 4 of them were based on fieldwork. So basically we had nothing. So we started investigating and saw that in these eastern floodplains in the Llanos, the traditional activity is extensive cattle ranching, and cattle ranchers have a very intimate connection to their environment, to wildlife. They do use subsistence hunting, but only kill males, for example. They also have a lot of traditions, music and poems and handicrafts related to armadillos. For example, they think that drinking armadillo blood cures asthma. So there's a lot of cultural importance for armadillos, which was a good baseline for us. The thing is that over the past decades, there's been a lot of promotion of agro-industrial activities and oil extraction in the Llanos. So this required a lot of workforce that came in from big cities. So these were people with a high income, but no cultural connection to the area, and no knowledge of the local wildlife, but they wanted to try something different and ask for wild meat in the restaurants. So that led to commercial hunting, which is illegal, but it was a source of income for these local restaurants. Now here, there's also something I really want to stress. You have to be realistic when you do conservation. You cannot stop the development of a country or of a region for the sake of wildlife conservation. It just does not work. I mean, it would be cool just to declare the entire Llanos as protected areas, but this won't work. So we need to find ways for both to coexist. And that was the approach that we used in our conservation program in the Llanos of Colombia, which addresses the 5 species, but focuses a little bit more on giant armadillos and the near-threatened northern long-nosed armadillo. So when we initiated that program in 2012, we set it up as a multi-institutional program. It was very important to us to involve all stakeholders. So we have private companies, we have NGOs, we have foundations that help us economically. The community was a fundamental part since the beginning, and also a local zoo and the environmental authorities of the Llanos. So we started working with all these stakeholders and developed an action plan, which is kind of the classic approach to do conservation, right? So we identified gaps in knowledge, which were huge. We identified the main threats and developed 7 lines of action. So what we wanted to do within this program is to seek solutions that allow the economic development and conservation to coexist, because otherwise we knew that in this region it would not work. So we had to be quite creative. For example, there are oil palm plantations in the Llanos. Let me add that there is no deforestation for these plantations, but they are using actually the grasslands. So we started working with them and promoted armadillos, because armadillos eat insects. So they could eat the pests of these oil palms, which then would lead to a reduction in the use of insecticides, which is beneficial because it's an economic benefit for the plantations. But also we started developing a label that is called armadillo-friendly palm oil. What we want to do here is to promote good practices that favor the presence of armadillos in plantations. This is obviously positive for the armadillos. Now, what's the benefit for the plantations? This label facilitates then the certification of their product in the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, RSPO. And this allows them to sell their products on the international market, for example, in Europe. Of course, we needed to have evidence that to show that this really works. So we started implanting radio transmitters into giant armadillos and northern long-nosed armadillos. We're doing radio tracking, and what we want to see is the habitat use that armadillos do in plantations. So we're comparing plantations with different management techniques so that we can tell the plantation owners which management techniques are more beneficial for armadillos. We are also doing analysis of the food availability and the diet of armadillos in plantations to show them, to have evidence that armadillos eat these pest species. It's a long-term project. We're working on it, but we've seen a lot of interest in plantations. We're now also starting to work with timber plantations in the areas, and they see the benefit of doing wildlife conservation. We obviously know that conservation can be effective without the involvement of the community because, I said, it's multi-institutional and we included them from the beginning. And one of the ways we found to involve the locals is to sign conservation agreements because we cannot declare so many protected areas. So we need to protect the armadillos on private lands. So we sign conservation agreements with private farms, reserves, plantations. People commit to not allowing commercial hunting on their lands, and we train them in community-based science. So we train them in the use of camera traps so that they can monitor their wildlife. They report, for example, sightings of armadillos in calendars that we developed so that we have more information about xenartrans, armadillos in the llanos, but also other wildlife that can be very helpful. And we see that they become very enthusiastic about that because they suddenly see the huge amount of wildlife they have on their lands, and they start thinking about conservation issues. So up to now, we're providing effective protection for armadillos in an area of over 1,000 square kilometers, which is beneficial to the armadillos. On the other hand, we do a huge amount of education work. So we publish books and we have websites in development. We establish armadillos as flagship species of the llanos. So we have schools with paintings on their walls. There are some small towns that have armadillo monuments. And we also work with the indigenous communities. We teach them how to make handicrafts in the shape of armadillos. For example, these are cell phone holders with an armadillo on it. So we've reached up to now over 20,000 persons directly with our education programs, but about 500,000 indirectly with exhibits and videos and radio programs, etc. So really, we've seen over the past 10 years that there is a change. They know about armadillos, they like armadillos, and they try to protect them. I'll have to speed up a little bit because we're running out of time. But also hunting, as I mentioned, is a problem, the commercial hunting. So we started working with the restaurants. We know that they sell these armadillos because of commercial issues, economic benefits. So we try to train them so that they can increase their revenues in other ways without having to recur to an illegal activity, such as selling wild meat. So we train them, for example, in food handling, economy, etc., or administration. We certify them with a label that they can exhibit. There are controls being done by the environmental authorities to make sure that they really don't sell wild meat if they commit to that label. And we promote the restaurants on websites and radio campaigns. We also give them placemats, for example, with games for the kids. We give a certification. So they also multiply our conservation message and transmit it to the locals. And of course, not only armadillos benefit from that, but also tapirs and capybaras and deer and other hunted species. This also required us to train the authorities, create awareness, but also train them in handling. We developed a manual on rehab and rescue of armadillos so that the authorities would be prepared to take care of these armadillos. And this benefited from my experience here in Mendoza. So we will link these conservation programs and see what can be applied if from one program in another country. So I know there's still a huge amount to do until we can warrant that the long-term conservation of armadillos, both in Argentina and Colombia. But, there's one take-home message that I would like to transmit, that armadillos might not be the most charismatic species for most people, but if you are passionate enough, if you're an advocate for a poorly known species, any species, you can bring about a significant change. You can really make it happen. So I think that's the most important thing about that. Nobody cared about armadillos when we started, and look where we got. So you can reach the same with any species that you are passionate about. So I would like to thank you again, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have.
Awesome. Thank you again, Mariella. That was a really fantastic talk, and really awesome to see all the amazing and creative community work that you're doing. Looks like we do have a question in the chat. I don't know if you can read that. If not, I'm happy to read it out. The drug drivers issue is limited to Brazil. So if you don't read the chat, the question is, does any of the public education work focus on reducing superstitions like with the truck drivers and blood drinking, or is it mostly focused on anti-poaching efforts? We address the roadkills by working directly with the truck drivers, but there are no superstitions in Argentina or in Colombia. That's apparently an issue that is limited to Brazil. Now, the blood drinking, that's something that we're working on to create awareness, because, I mean, it's fun to drink armadillo blood, but we study Chagas disease, and Chagas is a blood parasite. So if you drink armadillo blood, you could get rid of your asthma, but then you get Chagas, which I don't know what's worse. So we're slowly trying to teach people about that. We talk about zoonotic diseases so that they are aware that there is a problem, or there might be a problem, that they could become affected with other diseases when they drink armadillo blood. Although then they say, well, that they mix it with white wine, I think, and that would kill then the parasite. But yeah, we're working on it. So if you would like to open your microphones and just ask directly, that would be even more fun. Well, I've got a question if nobody else does. So obviously you've done all this community work, and kind of talked early on too about the importance of communicating with the local communities in their language to actually get this sort of effective change. A lot of the people that are listening in, including myself, are graduate students that are constantly sort of thinking about publishing our work and how we're going to kind of share it with the world. And I'm curious if you have any, advice, tips, suggestions on, how to maybe best approach that sort of knowledge sharing, not just in the realm of, the scientific community, but with local communities. How do we make it more accessible?
Yeah, I've seen that problem that some colleagues here, even colleagues here at our research center, say, well, but why don't the authorities approach me if they have a problem with whatever, invasive species, for example? I'm the expert. I said, well, how does the authority know that you're the expert? I said, well, I publish a lot. I said, well, they're politicians. They don't read papers, and even less so if they're in English. So I don't like to criticize. I like to provide solutions. And I think that's a key component of doing conservation. It's not worth criticizing that the authorities don't do anything. Be proactive, talk to them. I would, for example, I would publish my work, of course, because I have to, but I would always make a Spanish summary in an easy language, which actually is a very good exercise because as researchers, we're not used to writing in simple language. So try it out. It's really interesting because you have to change your mindset and change the whole language you use on a daily basis so that you can communicate your research results and also think about how it impacts conservation, because sometimes it's very clear for you as a graduate student what this means. But if you just show your results, for example, if I tell the authorities, oh, peaches hibernate and enter torpor, and enter deeper torpor during environmental stress, they're going to look at me and say, what does this mean? And why is that important for conservation? So think about that. Think about the practical application and try to transmit that in a simple summary, abstract, or even give a talk to the public, to the general public, or to the authorities.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, that was really helpful. Looks like we do have another question in the chat. How easy or difficult is it to work across national boundaries for the northern conservation in South America?
Yeah, it depends a little bit. We're struggling to do, for example, molecular analysis to see if there are differences. For example, supposedly there are 2 tamandua species, but we're not sure. But the southern tamandua occurs in all of South America. And with the Nagoya Protocol, it's very difficult to export samples because each country interpreted the Nagoya Protocol in a way that they have to protect their genetic resources, so they don't allow exports. Not even for scientific purposes. So we're not allowed to send samples from Argentina to Brazil because the Argentinian authorities say, oh no, why don't you just bring the Brazilian samples to Argentina and do the analysis here, and Brazilians say the same. So we're quite stuck for the molecular analysis. And so that's a very difficult issue. Now, as we are such a small group, of people working on xenotroph conservation, we know each other, so it is easy to collaborate. So I have a graduate student in Chile, a master student in Colombia. It implies a lot of traveling, which is fun, but you always have to adjust to the local idiosyncrasy. So it's different to work with authorities in Chile than it is to work in Honduras, for example. So that makes it a little bit more difficult. And to bring everybody on the same table is virtually impossible. So that's also why we're trying to do more local conservation work and then adjust it and replicate it and adjust it in other countries. So yeah, maybe in that context, it's also interesting that we wanted to have one specialist group member from each range country, and we don't have that because there are some range countries where there's not a single researcher working with xenothrons. So what we do now is to train people. So we find enthusiastic master students, for example, and we motivate them, we train them so that they can work with xenothrons and develop their xenotroph conservation program in their home country. What's the adult size of a pink fairy armadillo? Well, that was, I think it was the picture of my hands. Well, that's, it weighs 100 grams, 117 grams max, and it's about 10 centimeters long. And it lives underground, so you can't even find it. Imagine that I've been working in Mendoza province for 20 years, more than 20 years. I've never seen one in the wild. So, yeah. Advice on how you in the US can help further conservation of these species. We're having significant problems with the pet trade into the US. We're actually investigating that right now. We've done some campaigns with the American Zoo Association, AZA, to deter the whole thing of keeping tamanduas as pets. I think that that's one of the fundamental things that need to be done in the US, create awareness, also work against that whole selfie tourism, which is an increasing problem. And of course, you can support conservation. You can do conservation in South America. I mean, I did all my field work for my PhD in Argentina while studying in New Orleans until Katrina hit, but yeah.
I had another question if we don't have any more in the chat. You mentioned the challenges of attempting to count armadillos and get population estimates, and how that kind of then feeds back into IUCN
Yeah.
classifications. Are there any measures or sampling procedures that are out there that are being developed there that you've attempted to implement to try and count these armadillos, especially like the pink fairy one that live, their whole lives underground?
There are some data, for example, from 9-banded armadillos in Georgia and Florida that Jim Laufrey and Colleen McDonough did, but that was a long-term study on 9-banded armadillos in the US, which is one of the few studies we have on armadillo population, but we do not know if that information applies to South American populations. Then we have another study by Agustin Naba on screaming hairy armadillos. Look them up on YouTube if you don't know what I'm talking about, because screaming hairy armadillos are very cool. But other than that, we don't. There was a recent study by Roxane Schaub, which is a French physician who did leprosy studies in French Guyana. She did transects and marked every single armadillo burrow she could find in her plot, and set up camera traps in front of every single active burrow. And that was the first attempt to link the number of burrows with the number of armadillos in an area. But it was done in French Guyana in the Amazon, and I live in the desert work with other species, so I cannot use her extrapolations. We don't know what the differences are between different species, different habitats. You cannot trap armadillos. Makes it even more fun. So all that tomahawk trap stuff doesn't work with armadillos because they don't enter traps. But camera trapping is helping us a lot. So, for example, you can individually identify giant armadillos based on their carapace pattern. So that is really helpful. Now for pink fairy armadillos, we're trying to work with Global Wildlife Force on training dogs to find them. So possibly next year we're bringing a trained dog here to Mendoza and try to find pink fairy armadillos. We don't know if it's working, but we'll try. You have to be creative.
Yeah, that's really cool. And it seems like those are the two methods that are kind of coming out, camera trapping and conservation dogs is some of the best tools out there now for detecting species. That's really cool. It does look like we're right at about time. maybe we can hang on for a second if anybody does have any last questions, but otherwise, we'll see everyone again next week.
Okay, thank you so much for allowing me to talk about my creatures. I just love them.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's not too often we get to hear about armadillos. They're
Yeah.
really fascinating creatures.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks again.